This is the live broadcast of the Sydney International Piano Competition 2023. And joining me now is one of the jurors, of course, Alasdair Tait. Thank you so much for finding some time. It must be a bit lonely up there, one cellist and all those pianists. It must be, are you a minority?
I don't feel like a minority. I mean, I do try and bring them back from constant piano talk, sometimes to more general, can we just not talk about pianos for 5 minutes? But I mean, pianists and string players, it's the natural match.
It is.
In life anyway, so.
It is.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, one of the things we're going to discuss now, of course. Who better in the world to talk about chamber music, and particularly cello and piano, and of course, your many, many years in a quartet.
Yeah.
Tell us about the role of the cello in a quartet, perhaps, first of all. It's...
Well, it's crucial, and I think it also relates to this competition a little bit as well. I mean, without my belief, and for me, there's very few absolute truths in music, but there is one truth, which is without a harmonic direction, without a harmonic impulse that is everything else sits upon, everything else crumbles. It is the thing that drives, it's the thing that provides the momentum, it gives the direction, it gives the shape, it gives the pulse, it gives the everything. So I often, jokingly, when I'm working with young quartets, one of the first things I find myself often saying is sort of whispering a sort of very loud aside to the cellist about saying, you do control everything, but your role is to make sure that everyone else feels that they're controlling everything, and you don't need to say anything, but fundamentally,
Wow. Well, that's quite something.
But in a way with
Don't
piano,
get caught by a violinist saying that, of course, yeah.
The point is, I think they need to hear it. So, but I think also it relates to piano as well. And it's been very interesting just who is listening to just the left hand? What is guiding someone as a musician? Is it just purely a melody, or actually is it the full structure? Is it how are they thinking from harmonic step to harmonic step? And so, just the bass line is so important.
Indeed, and of course the bass line in a quartet, as you pointed out, and that role. But what about then bringing the cello and the piano together? When you perform with a pianist, how do you know that pianist is really supporting the cello in the way that it needs to be supported? I mean, we had Kathy here, of course, the other day. Absolutely. Who knows better in the world? Well, cello and
absolutely and cello
piano repertoire than Kathy Stott.
One of my really, really strong memories when still playing in my quartet was actually performing quite a bit with Kathy when we did piano quintets, specifically Elgar Quintet in Albury Festival. It's one of the first times I'd known her at festivals, but it is an interesting question because the pianist I really remember and loved playing with is a very, very simple feeling playing with them, whether that's cello piano or whether that's quartet and quintet. And the way I always describe it is you just feel that you're being absolutely carried along. You're not being driven, but you're being supported. You have as much space as you need. But then as well, there's this constant interaction. So you actually feel that together you're creating a whole score. It's not two separate people. You've both come together and you're both so aware of how the score is constructed that lines interweave. They come, who's instigating, who's responding. You know the question or you know the answer at any point. And within any musical score, that's constantly shifting. And that's not just in the pianist. The pianist himself has to think of what's happening between their left hand, right hand, voicing. Is it happening between hands? What are the different roles of any one particular motive or part, and how do the two people respond? But back to the initial thing. You just feel carried, you feel supported, and Kathy was extraordinary. Like that is extraordinary.
Yeah, and I guess also for pianists, also one of the areas of music where you can hear that the most will be the voicing in something from Bach, for example. Where you can hear very clearly then how the different hands work and function together. Yeah.
I mean, Bach, let's say a fugue, 4-part fugue, that's exactly the same as a quartet. And again, another way I always work with quartets is the minute everything feels it's doing the same thing, you've lost a fundamental aspect of music making, which is tension release, resistance, and sort of giving stretch and pulling back. And a way I often phrase to quartet players is every note you play should have a physical effect on what someone else is doing at the same time as every note someone else is playing is affecting how you're playing, which gives us elasticity. And again, even within a Bach fugue, the pianist job, it's not easier. I think it's just taking the focus differently, that they have to then work out 4, 5, 6 different characters. And what are all these characters doing to each other? The difficulty being that it's in one set of hands. Whereas at least within, let's say, chamber music, when you have 2 voices, 3 voices, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, it's easier for them to know that they're inhabiting one particular role and then jumping to another role. And so I think I think that's why people love watching string quartets.
Yeah.
Without them realizing it, they're getting this almost visualization of the musical conversation in front of them. And so the hardest thing as the pianist is to really bring, for me, that conversation to life, albeit through one person. And that's absolutely down to them understanding the texture, the score, the voicing, and being able to differentiate these voices and what the voices are doing to each other.
And then, of course, with the extra person listening to what they're doing and bringing and incorporating that in there as well. And it's not about conversations, as in, chatting. It's really about something else, isn't it?
It is. Listening for me is not a passive process. And I think a lot of younger musicians often think that if their ears are clean, they don't need their ears syringed, then they're hearing something, then they're listening. But listening for me is a very, very active process, which is about connection to your internal version of the score. What is it that you, as a musician, are connected with and wanting to then hear, and then how you're putting it through your fingers, your voice, if you're a singer, whatever, is then the secondary step, and it's more just the reproduction of what that inner voice is. And if they're connected to that, then they're listening, and then what they're hearing is, does this actually match what's happening inside? And then they can adjust and think, actually, oh, my finger seems to have done this in a way the finger wants to do it, rather than actually what my intention was.
Wow.
And it's a big shift for me for any instrument to, are they being led by what makes it most physically comfortable? Or are they actually letting their body bring their musical intention through, regardless of, maybe that makes it more difficult or more resistance or creates more tension? It's a different balance for me.
You've worked a lot with young people and of course coaching them in chamber music. And I guess when you bring a group together, trying to get that happening must be actually, first of all, a huge task, but at the same time quite magical to see that grow. What we call in musical terms the ensemble, isn't it? Right? Yeah. Which is more important in chamber music than anything else, isn't it, really?
In a way, it's not, I don't really see it as a big task. It's more a process, I think, more often than not, of finding a few little keys to help them unlock and change their position of where they're coming from. And it can feel a small thing, but quite radical for a group. Because I think a lot of the time they get so obsessed with, I can understand why, because there's such a pressure to deliver a good, supposedly correct performance. But especially in ensemble playing, there's a huge focus in young groups on trying to play together. And it becomes such an organized effort. And in their process of trying to organize things, what I feel they do is actually create a more and more rigid prison, which allows them to feel safe, but actually what they're doing is blocking any sense of natural communication. And rather it's trying to get them to think that when they're rehearsing, the more they understand what are the basic structural scaffolding together of which they're all looking towards, if they all understand how they're breathing together, then actually that allows them to become totally individual and then inhabit their own individual role at any one point. But it starts from trust. And the trust is the hardest thing when everyone feels judged and criticised. So there's lots of these things within chamber music, especially in quartets, trios, that until they have this respect that they're all looking for the same thing and that there are multiple possibilities as long as the fundamental direction is the same, then they can be much freer musicians. And bringing it back to the competition here, there's a very short window of time for the competitors to come together with Leeway, with Andrew, who know these works inside out. But it's how courageous are they to think, okay, I've done all my practice and what I think is a preparation for this, and now I want to be changed by what this person is bringing. And together we're going to produce a unique performance. And I think, without giving anything away, I think it's been quite a challenge for everyone I've heard so far.
Well, it's more of an instinctive thing rather than an intellectual exchange, isn't it, really? They have to trust their instincts and they have to let go. What you're saying,
Absolutely.
Put down that prism, get that out of the way
Absolutely.
and dive in there and do it. And of course they have to know the music well, don't they?
They all know the music well.
Right.
But I think they certainly know it very well from one certain perspective.
Okay, yes.
Which is the perspective of their practice room.
Yeah.
And their concept. And the whole point of chamber music, again, as I said earlier, is that you are confident enough to open yourself up to what someone else is bringing to the table. And together, chamber music is about what happens when the sum of the parts together produces something even more special and exciting.
Alasdair, as well as being a phenomenal cellist and all this experience that you've got in teaching and all the rest of it, you're also a psychodynamic psychotherapist. I mean, that's quite interesting because your work must sort of all run in together with each other. When you have a group of young musicians playing in a quartet and communicating and helping them to read and understand the others, to also be able to be on the outside of that and analyse it in a slightly different sort of way, that must be very, very interesting, yeah?
It's increasingly fascinating for me. Actually, I stopped practicing a few years ago, just before I've been in private practice for about 10 years. For no other reason, just timing and so much else was happening. I used to, in a way, try and keep the two things very separate. But of course, they're absolutely linked in everything I'm doing. And everything's about listening and the approach. Obviously, I'm not working as a therapist with any of the groups at all. There's very strict boundaries.
But you can't turn that part of you off, can you? Yeah.
But what fascinates me, and I think what is so important, is that line of communication. How are they communicating to each other? And of course, not with words, but there's a constant emotional dialogue going on. And then it's how they're challenging defenses and how can they start to be a bit more vulnerable with each other and also not block each other. But of course, everyone blocks everyone in different ways, and we all block ourselves. And that's what I find fascinating, are these interrelating threads of communication, of roles, all in the service of how are they finding something about themselves which maybe they weren't as aware of at the beginning of the rehearsal, at the beginning of a performance.
Indeed. Alasdair, you see these performers over a number of days. I guess you see them progressing and perhaps performing a little bit differently and feeling a little bit more secure about their performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that's most fascinating for me is getting to know the different personalities over so many rounds. And even the minute they walk on stage, they're starting to tell you more and more about themselves. And that's fascinating. And the strength of character, the energy, and also just it's a dangerous and difficult word, charisma, because there's not really a definition for that, but there's something palpable when you start to see those who have something that's really connecting with you, even in their less good days. And so seeing some competitors who have really good days, everyone also has a day which they've maybe not been so focused. Have they slept as well? Have they not slept as well? What's going on? And that's real life. And I think that's really important reflection in competitions, that no matter how well prepared you are, you still have to just go out and deal with the situation, the time of day, how you're feeling at that point, and whatever. And yeah, I think how the competitors are each starting to show, even in the best bits and maybe the less focused bits, what is that core and what's the real voice that no matter how they feel, they're still delivering. And that's really fascinating for me.
Indeed. You know, we are facing in the world today a number of big questions. And I'm wondering what you think perhaps the role of the musician is in this day and age. What musicians can be contributing, what their role is in some way. It's a big question, and you know.
It's a big question, but a really important question. I mean, the arts, I think everywhere, are probably struggling more than they have done for a long time just to justify their existence. I think everyone says, of course, we love the arts, but there's funding that's necessary. There's big arguments, and there's lots of really major competitors for this. naturally so, and there have to be. And first of all, I think musicians have to realise how they do fit into a much wider ecosystem, much wider sort of cross-section of cultural challenges. But for younger musicians, I think the days of this pseudo-fantasy career of just sitting back, waiting for a career to be delivered to them on a plate because of this wonderful talent that they've been somehow given and everyone is going to do everything for them, I'm afraid these days are absolutely gone. And the most interesting artists who are really engaged and at the highest level, whether that's established artists or actually young emerging artists, are those who are really connecting so many different aspects of society. I mean, you talked of Cathy and Yo-Yo Ma. I mean, he's a perfect example of someone whose his interests are so wide and open and curious. And I thought a lot about it during COVID as well. I think a lot of younger musicians especially, I think partly because they're spending so much time on their own and practicing, it's very easy for them to separate from the fact that a musician, a performing musician, is there as a giver. And I think a lot are still waiting to just receive. And it's for me, it's really important that we go on stage and our job is to give. It is to communicate something that we feel at that point is something that's happening in that moment, in a spontaneous moment, and is giving something to every single individual person. Every person in the hall will receive something differently, but it's still giving. And then what you get in return, you get a huge amount in return from the audience, but it starts from giving. And I think a lot of musicians sometimes forget that they're there to do it in whatever venue they are, whether that's Carnegie Hall, Wigmore Hall, Sydney Opera House, or a tiny church in the north of Scotland, or a small village hall in the north of Australia. It doesn't matter where you are. Your job is actually to give, and that you will reach someone in front of you. And that communication is the most important thing that we can offer at the moment.
And of course, it's quite athletic, and it's really requiring from them on so many different levels, isn't it? You know, physically, psychologically, personally. You know, they're going to be exhausted at the end of this, aren't they? If they do it properly, yeah?
So I think we're all exhausted already. We've got another week to go. No, it's been thrilling, but it's a marathon, the competitions. But it's really important, that stamina. They need stamina to go out and actually deliver.
Yeah.
As a profession,
yes.
You need to be available for every eventuality, and that requires a lot of resilience and just bloody-minded strength, actually.
Alasdair Tait, thank you so much. Member of the jury, of course, here. It's lovely to talk to you as well. And you, of course, have been watching the live broadcast of the Sydney International Piano Competition 2023.